Welcome, dear friends, to this captivating compilation of stories. In case you missed any of our previous episodes, or simply wish to relive those fun stories, all you need to do is hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. By doing so, you'll gain unlimited access to our incredible collection of stories. Remember to jot down the timestamps of your favorite stories, and don't hesitate to drop them in the comments section below. We cherish the thoughts and feedback from each one of our cherished viewers. We sincerely appreciate your presence here, and our primary aim is to ensure you have an unforgettable experience throughout the show. So without further ado, let's kickstart this amazing compilation. Serious, what's the most disturbing thing in your family's history? Story 1. There are objectively worse things in my family's history, but the most chilling was learning how my grandfather abused animals. He was a real pillar of the community, well-to-do, stable home life, responsible husband. For a while, they lived in a house that could be called a country estate. That large property came with a cat when they bought it. She was a barn cat, a mouser. Long after they had sold the property, my mother and grandmother were reminiscing about the place, remembered the cat, and wondered what had happened to her kittens. Smiling, he joined the conversation, saying, "I asphyxiated them." Then he described how he bundled up each litter of kittens into a bag and tied it to the car exhaust, running the car on idle until they stopped moving. Then he buried them out back. Instead of ever getting the cat spayed, he let her keep having litters and executed every one of them. Never tried to find homes for the kittens, never took them to a shelter. Cost was no barrier. This man had a country club membership and owned a yacht. Yet he was the sort of man who was polite to the waiters, also a doting and loyal husband. Grandmother passed away when I was 19, and the only quarrel I ever saw between them didn't last 5 seconds. No one suspected he was capable of this, not even his wife. When he finally admitted, no one treated it like it mattered. I was in my teens in the same room while this conversation occurred, listened in stunned silence, and didn't know what to think of it long afterward. Story 2. The first person in my family to immigrate to America was granted an insane amount of land in order to help settle and lead a town in Virginia. 31 years later, he testified against his 2 eldest sons for skipping church 3 Sundays straight. They were fined 100 acres of tobacco each. 2 weeks later, he threw the first stone in a public stoning that resulted in their deaths. They had been convicted of devil worship after skipping church 5 Sundays in a row. He was then forced to resign from all public offices he had. The following Sunday, while everyone was in church, he and his only remaining son burned down every building in the town except for the church. They skipped town and set fire to every tobacco field that had been forfeited on their way to Texas. They changed the spelling of our last name when they settled in Texas. The only reason we know this happened is because census records show both of them mysteriously appearing in a town in Texas with an almost identical name. They simply changed the spelling to the phonetic version of spelling it. Didn't bother lying about their ages or where they came from at all. The surviving son had only one child that survived birth. That son became a bank robber in his late 60s so that he could pay for his children to go to law school. Somehow, our family is known for famous lawyers, and not the first 3 generations of criminals in America. Interesting. The son that was a robber committed crimes as a means to an end in order to set his own kids up for a life of opportunity. Yeah, it's ironic that they became lawyers, but ultimately, if there were multiple generations of lawyers that followed, and assuming each of them truly upheld and fought for justice, then would you say the impact of their collective efforts outweighs the initial wrongdoings of the ancestors and maybe even absolves them of their misdeeds? Of course, not at an individual level, because the arson and robberies shouldn't be forgiven, but the family name as a whole seems to have turned a new leaf. Story 3. My mom's uncle lived modestly in a trailer and had no job, outside of a few manual labor jobs here and there. He would routinely get behind on bills and often had his water and other utilities cut off or threatened to be cut off. On several occasions, he would disappear to a large city 3 hours north of his home for a few days. Every time he came back, he had tons of cash. One night, over a poker game, some people were talking trash, and he mentioned that none of them had any idea what it was like to end the life of a man. One of the people there was my mom's cousin, who claimed that he overheard the conversation. Of course, they probed him for more info, but he wouldn't say anything else. Everyone in the family knew he had a knack for coming into large sums of cash, but no one ever really knew how he got it, other than maybe poker. He passed away about 10 years ago. I'm 37, and I just heard this story for the first time over Thanksgiving dinner last week. TLDR, my great-uncle may have been a hitman. Story 4. My grandfather managed to get his 3 kids and his wife out of Europe just before the Nazis invaded their country. The rest of that side of my family, every one of them, stayed behind and had their lives ended in concentration camps. Decades after this, after my grandparents had passed away, and even their kids were quite old, we found a trove of letters, dozens of them. They were from those family members, clearly responding to my grandfather's repeated pleas to leave as well. Each and every one said they were absolutely certain they would be fine, and it seemed as if they thought my grandfather was an alarmist and a bit of a kook. So many letters from so many people he was trying to save, and just wouldn't let him do it. I never met my grandfather because he passed away of a mysterious condition soon after they emigrated. Now that I think about it, in light of him writing his original letters and getting those responses, I think he passed away of a broken heart. Story 5. A great aunt of mine ended her own life, which is disturbing, but unfortunately not all that uncommon. What does it for me is the fact that we are not allowed to talk about it. My mom knows, and my aunt knows, but the woman's kids still think that she passed away of a heart attack. We are a Catholic family, so I get it, but in my view, that is not something that should be swept under the rug. Also, my mom's cousin, son of the previously mentioned great aunt, apparently had a tendency to go into a blind rage, at least in his younger years. My aunt had told me that he'd go out and pick fights and then just beat the crap out of the dude until he had to be taken to the hospital. This was at a time and place where it could all be attributed to a drunk bar fight, but my aunt has said that the dull, soulless look in his eyes as he beat up these people always freaked her out. Story 6. One of my uncles passed away as a baby, age 1, 1960s. Everyone knows that he was left in the bath when my grandmother went to answer the phone, and she came back to find that the water was too hot and had burned him alive in the bathtub. Turns out my grandma, who already had 2 children and probably wouldn't have made a rookie mistake like that, sent my aunt, age 4, and the other uncle, age 3, to take a nap, and was across the house on the phone, so she didn't hear them start the water to give my youngest uncle a bath. They were playing bath time and accidentally burned him alive in the bathtub, and neither of them knows the truth or remembers it. My grandmother won't tell them because she doesn't want them to blame themselves. Not sure why my mom knows, who then relayed it to me during a deep conversation over family issues. Story 7. I heard this one just last week. My great-grandpa had 4 kids, pretty young, and was dealing with some depression due to how hard his life was. He left my great-grandma out of nowhere when she was only 28, and years later, she saw him again with his new wife and 4 new kids, with the same dang names. He pretty much made a new version of his old family once he had the money to support them. Their last name is now infamous to my family, and I've actually met a kid with the last name, and I've always wanted to ask who his great-grandpa is to see if he's somehow related to me. Story 8. Any semblance of my family's history, photos, records, heirlooms, property, etc., was wiped away by Pol Pot's regime. Anything left, a few family photos or necklaces, were smuggled on each person that valued it. 80% of my family don't actually have memories of their birthdays, as many of them were adolescents surviving years in the killing fields. So 80% of my family don't actually know how old they are. Everything I know of my parents, uncles and aunts and grandparents before the war are anecdotal recollections, and with only one surviving grandparent, it's hard to piece together a complete story. I and my siblings will literally be the only generation with a record of existence in my family. Story 9. We have 2 especially weird ones on my grandpa's side. My grandpa's grandmother, known to all 5 people who knew about her as Grandmother Burr, had really intense dementia, so by the late 1950s, she thought she had gone back to her childhood during the Civil War and was kept in an attic in my great-grandparents' house in rural Louisiana. My grandma didn't even know she existed until the fourth or fifth time she visited her in-laws, and Grandmother Burr somehow broke out of the attic and started screaming about the Yankees. Grandmother Burr had a cousin who apparently once shot the former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury in a duel or something. Story 10. My mom's distant cousin strangled her twin babies when they were a few days old. They already had one set of twins and one more child, so two more were just too expensive. She buried them in their garden, but it was too shallow, so local dogs dug them up, ate, and played with their remains. The worst thing is, all locals knew about that, but no police or CPS were involved, because it was common to get rid of unwanted children in that way 30 years ago. Teachers with former students returning to visit you, what's the most unexpected thing they've told you? Story 1. I've taught in the military for many years, and I substitute teach in my time off in local schools around town. I absolutely love teaching. It's so much fun to go into a class and not know what you're getting into. And when you're substitute teaching, you have to try and figure out how to connect with a random group of kids. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. But more often than not, I succeed. I hope to be a real teacher when I retire in a few years from the military. Anyways, this story is about one of my students when I started teaching in the military. I'll call him Cornhusker. Cornhusker was a student I had in my first year of teaching. I always remember that he had a big smile on his face, and he'd do these awesome Yoda or George Bush impressions to lighten the class up. Having a person like this in your classroom is always a joy. He was a great guy, and he and I continued to talk and correspond after he graduated the class. I ended up starting a public speaking group on the base, and he was one of the members that always came out to the events and supported everything we did. And as I was doing all this stuff on the side, I was still teaching 10 to 12 hours a day when you count lesson preparation. I was getting worn out. I gave a lot of myself to each class, and this can be emotionally exhausting work. My old boss, kind of like the school principal, once told me that he was worried about my health because I put so much of myself out there. And as a teacher, you rarely get that back in return from the students. I didn't really know what he meant at the time, but as the years went on, I began to understand what he meant. You empty so much of yourself in each class that it can be so hard when that isn't reciprocated or noticed by anyone. It can make you tired and jaded. Well, this good boss ended up leaving the school, and we got a new boss in his place. She said she wasn't going to change anything. Note to self, whenever someone says they aren't going to change something, that means they're going to change everything. It was a nightmare working for her. She was an obsessive micromanager. She was able to get results, but only by grinding her people down to the bone. But she was able to mind control you in the same way that a psychologically abusive mother can control her children. I promise you this story is leading somewhere. This woman started to sap my will to teach out of me. And through a combination of always putting myself out there and never getting anything back in return, I started to dislike teaching. The new boss and I got into a huge fight one morning, and I started to question my self-worth and what I was doing as a teacher in the military. But totally out of the blue and without any prompting from me, I got an email from Cornhusker that very afternoon. He said that it was obvious that I put myself out there and tried my best to make all my students and everyone around me better. He said even though this was obvious, he didn't think that people ever told me how much they appreciated this. It was the most perfectly timed email I've ever received, and one that I still cherish. He then proceeds to write 2 paragraphs of the nicest compliments I'd ever read. I was floored, stunned. I was like the gods of karma, and they had told him to send me that message so that it could keep me going. And it did. I kept teaching the way I wanted to, and the way I believed was right. I put all my effort into teaching, doubled down on my efforts, and a cool thing started to happen. More and more of my old students started sending me random messages, telling me how much they appreciated me as an instructor or coming by my office to say hello. It was a great feeling. I knew what I was doing was the right thing. In the moment when I most questioned my abilities, Cornhusker managed to bring me up when I most needed it. I think these random acts of kindness happen too infrequently. So I always make it a point after I've read a good story or article to message the author and tell them why I enjoyed it. If I listen to an unknown band and really dig their music, I'll shoot them an email on Facebook. And it's all because Cornhusker taught me how powerful a random message from someone can keep you going when you're at your lowest point. And the same goes for liking and subscribing to YouTube channels. Story 2. I sucked at math. I sucked at math so freaking hard. I think it had more to do with our ridiculous method of teaching concepts from the top down rather than the bottom up that tripped me up. But for whatever reason, I almost failed every single math class I ever took, and I almost ended up not graduating. I had one math teacher my junior year of high school that really busted her butt to help me graduate. Got me into credit recovery for some of my previously failed math classes, and probably single-handedly saved my butt. I was not sure if I was going to get to graduate until 5 minutes before the ceremony. I did thank her, but not as much as I should have. I didn't have the perspective to truly understand what she and my counselor did to get me through it. I went to community college for a year, but had to make up at least 2 semesters worth of math classes. The requirements changed a year before I got there, so I ended up dropping out. I did get a job as a help desk monkey at a managed service provider, though. Did a lot of tech work, got promoted up the help desk as far as I could go, and formed a really good mentoring relationship with the guy who owns the company. He's the quintessential hands-on management type. I ended up quitting because my direct boss was a jerk who didn't respect my boundaries. Found another job as a sysadmin. It paid very well, but I didn't feel like the work was very important or rewarding. It was an alternative media company. So I asked the company owner if I could come back as purely a network engineer and nothing else. He agreed and matched my current salary, plus profit sharing. Plus I get to run my own department autonomously, so I went back. A year or so later, my role has been evolving somewhat. I'm currently in the build-out stage for a bunch of new products and services being hosted out of our data center that were mostly my brainchild. I'm finally in a place to put money into savings, as well as a nice discretionary fund to do interesting stuff with. I'm 22 years old and haven't accepted a single dime of help from my parents since I was 19. My boss, the company owner, is very active in the community, as it turns out, including being on the board of trustees for the school district I attended high school at. I told him about how this teacher helped me out massively, and he nominated her for Teacher of the Year, opening this proposal with my story. I really wish I could have seen her face when she heard it. I really need to go visit her again. She definitely wasn't the only teacher that shaped my future, but my life would have gone in a completely different direction had I not graduated on time. Story 3. This is more the unexpected thing I told my former teacher when I became a teacher, and in return, the unexpected reply. When I started teaching at the high school from which I graduated, I went to a party at one of the administrators' houses the weekend before the first day of class. In attendance was my old 11th and 12th grade literature teacher, about 30 years my senior, smart and attractive as heck. She had taken early retirement the year before, but was still hanging out with old colleagues, and me. As the night went on, I got it in my head that I should ask Janet out, so I made my move about 6 beers in. I proposed we get dinner and drinks at a local establishment one night. She patted me on the head sweetly and said no. She couldn't go on a date with someone 30 years her junior, much less a former student. I plied her a little bit, assuring her that my intentions were innocent and that she'd always been my favorite teacher. And she actually said yes. Well, she said, okay, fine. But I was completely floored that I'd actually succeeded. Long story short, we have coffee, talk on the phone some, and when things started getting familiar, she got weird, and that was the end of it. Still felt like a triumph to 23-year-old me. Story 4. Late to this thread and will probably get buried, but I had a 6th grade science teacher who was really fun, and I used to stay after class to talk to him, and we became friends. I was always the kind of kid who got along better with the adults than with the other kids. A few years later, I was at a different school for middle school, and there was a geography bee, and by some miracle, I won it. I didn't even realize a geography bee existed until the day it happened. Apparently, I have a very good visual memory. For some reason, later that day, I had occasion to stop by my old elementary school to say hi to that 6th grade science teacher. He was very happy to see me, and we chatted for a while. I mentioned at the beginning that there had been a geography bee that day, but I didn't say how I fared, and we changed the subject and caught up about other things. He eventually asks me, "So, how'd you do in the geography bee?" I said, I won," and I reached into my pocket and pulled out the medal I had been given. He almost fell out of his chair. "You won?" It was great to see him, and great to give him that surprise. Story 5. Had to do a project when we were kids in high school, where we look at budgeting, college, and future finances. I went to the movies, and a student was working the concession. I asked what he was up to, and he said the fire academy at the local JC. He said he did that project and had to amend the future he had planned. Part of the project includes a sample community college entrance exam. 60% of kids don't pass. He attributed that to his decision. I felt kind of bad. I actually affected his future, and I don't know if it's for the better. I saw a student from my first year. I've been at this 10 years, but your first year is like a car accident. Memorable. One student, she was a little doo-doo. She would find these little ways to mess with me, just to mess with me. I'd call home, and Mom would just shrug it off. A couple months ago, I saw her at the mall. She'd be 26 or so by now. She was working mall security. I don't wish anything bad on her, but it figures. Serious. Doctors, have you ever wanted to refuse a patient? What did he or she do? Story 1. One night, I rode my bike home from the hospital. This was in a quiet and small town, and so I lived very close to the hospital. I see a couple on the side of the street arguing. Then suddenly he starts beating her. She screams and runs into the street to stop a car, but the only car coming along won't stop. So it ends up just being me and that couple. I must have been tired after a long shift, plus the environment is so non-threatening, small town, summer evening with still lots of daylight, and I completely misjudged the situation. I stop and offer the girl to accompany her to the ER, only a 5-minute walk, to get that cut lip taken care of. She hesitates and acts strangely, and I realize she's high the same moment I realize him approaching me. So I'm tall for a woman, but he's a really tall and strong guy. At this point, he's swearing at me, telling me how sad my parents will be after he will have beaten me to death with his bare hands. Last moment before he reaches me, I jump on my bike and race away as fast as I could. At home, I call the police to go look after the girl. 2 weeks later, I do the night shift, and guess who's brought in swearing and threatening to end everyone's lives? Stupid druggy guy. Apparently, he took too many sleeping pills and told his girlfriend, who called an ambulance. He then threatened to kill the EMTs, who promptly called the police. Then, of course, he threatened to kill the policeman, and they brought him to the ER, where everyone like that eventually ends up. I had been so scared when the first incident happened, and I had a visceral response when I saw him again. I really did not want to treat him. But this being a small-town hospital, I was the only doctor in the ER, in medicine, and I didn't really have a choice. So I had to examine him. I told the police what had happened before, and they stayed at my side the whole time. I vividly remember having to check his pupils and looking into his hate-filled junky eyes. Made me want to run away so bad. I ended up committing him for being a threat to himself and others. Psychiatry released him 2 days later, and he promptly came back to the ER when I wasn't there. Another ER doc committed him again, and psych released him again after 48 hours. It's just how the system worked. Security was crap at this little hospital, and I ended up refusing to do night shifts without better security. As the hospital was very cheap, they found a med student to shadow me. He was 6'something, all muscles, and an avid kickboxer in his free time. Druggy came back once, had an amicable chat with the med student, and as far as I know, never came back. I left the hospital soon afterwards, so yeah, boo for druggy patient, yay for med student who doubles as a kickboxer. Story 2. I'm on the other side of this one. When I was in my 20s, back in the 80s, I was working for a really poopy factory. I was unloading a truck and pulled a groin muscle, and at first it didn't seem too bad, and I just ignored it. One day it really flared up, and I was kind of scared and hurting. So I went to a local clinic, and at admitting, I was asked if it was work-related, and said yes, and the admitting lady stared at me as if I had 2 heads. I went in to see the doctor and told him what was wrong, and the jerk said, "You can't sue your company. You can go back to work tomorrow." And that was it. No explanation of what was wrong or any attempt at help, all delivered with a dismissive and contemptuous voice. At the time, I was young and dumb and pretty used to being treated like crap at home and at work, so I just left and accepted that as my fate. I've matured a lot since then and don't take that stuff anymore. Story 3. Some patients will obviously be difficult to care for, and there are plenty of other doctors in my area. A patient might call and insist on talking with me before making their initial appointment, then not let me off the phone with multiple questions. I'm generally busy trying to get to the next patient. Worse, they will start to disagree with my over-the-phone answers. This has happened more than once, and I've said to them, "I'm sorry, but I can tell you would be better off with another physician." At that point, they always back down and talk about how they've heard how wonderful I am, etc. But I let them know they need to call somebody else. The first time this happened, I'd been in practice only a short time and had lots of openings in my schedule, so I was very hesitant to do it. But I was very glad that I did and realized I had control over my life and my practice. Story 4. I'm a nurse at an allergy and immunology clinic. Since we are not an ER, we have the right to refuse patients. Most people are asked to leave simply because they're being jerks to the staff. People can get really angry and abusive about their bills. In my time, I've seen maybe 5 patients terminated for their inappropriate behavior. More often, the most interesting folks we turn away are not even patients. For a long time, we had a nice homeless man who would come in at least once a week in a tattered fake UPS uniform and ask if we had any packages. We would always tell him we did not, and he would quietly take a fistful of lollipops from the front desk and leave. We eventually had to tip off the building manager as patients were complaining, but I think about him every so often. I truly hope that somewhere, someone is providing him with candy. Story 5. I was a manager at a general practice surgery. I've kicked quite a few patients off our list, the majority for abusive, threatening, or racist behavior towards my staff, or attempting to defraud the practice. I did, however, refuse to have a patient attend the practice, insisting that he was only ever seen in his home. He was a convicted pedophile who'd also been done for assault on a girl the same age as 2 of my receptionists. He defecated and urinated in the clothes he stood up in, had probably not bathed since 1973, was permanently drunk, and on the one time he drove to the surgery, hit every wall, barrier, and car in the car park. Luckily, he was recalled to prison not long after he was assigned to us, and was not alive for long after that, having refused treatments for sepsis. Wretched creature. Story 6. I was a nurse at a walk-in clinic when we had a patient come in for a spider bite. She had a small, swollen spot on her butt and was probably bitten by some common house spider. Definitely not venomous. She wanted the doctor to make it disappear so that she could work that night. She was a stripper and knew that she would make less money with a red, swollen bump on her bum, a bump on her rump. The doctor couldn't do anything, and the patient got angry and started getting loud. She yelled loud enough for the whole clinic to hear, "Well, just suck it." She wanted the doctor to suck the venom from her butt. We immediately asked her to leave. After a few minutes of arguing, we had to call the police. TLDR, stripper wanted a spider bite on her butt sucked. Story 7. I worked in a GP's surgery for a while, and I know one of them has transferred at least 3 patients, 2 guys, 1 girl, for declaring their love for her. Also, a couple of ridiculously violent people, usually pain pill seekers, get kicked out. Bear in mind, this is in a dodgy area of Belfast, and half the patients are former or current paramilitary members. So violent means violent. Oh, that reminds me, a different doctor in the same surgery had his coat stolen by a patient, and one of the other patients, who was a paramilitary member, who really liked him, made sure he got it back with everything in it, minus money that had already been spent, and told him the thief patient would never bother him again. So I guess he had a patient refused on his behalf. Story 8. Sort of related. My office phone number is very similar to a pain management clinic's. I had the lovely opportunity to answer the phone of a very ticked-off patient who was being refused service and could not understand that she called the wrong number. I could only imagine what the poor workers there experienced with this woman. In the 5 conversations I'd had with her, I was called a lying chunt witch. She will find where I live and have her ex-con boyfriend beat the ever-loving poop out of me, and other various versions of threats of bodily harm and insults. This went on for a week straight before she realized that I wasn't playing a trick on her, that she actually called the wrong number. Story 9. All the time. I'm on my break on shift right now, and we've already thrown out 2 tonight. Abusive idiots who don't understand they can't just effing blind and get what they want. Every day we throw patients out here because, at least when I'm in charge, you don't get to walk into my emergency department and shout and be abusive and horrible when there are poorly patients and kids who don't want to hear that. I don't care if you don't want to wait or if you messed up your stupid foot being drunk. It could be busted to heck and back for all I care. If you're shouting and swearing in my face, you can go away. More doctors need this attitude, I feel. Story 10. This is also the other side of the coin, but as a teen in the 90s, I was particularly entrenched in the whole grunge punk look. I had terrible problems with ovarian cysts and had ongoing medical treatment for it. At one point, I was sent for an ultrasound, and the tech performing it started berating me, saying, "Your pain is obviously from all of the scar tissue here from your abortion," and kept making comments of the like. I was 16, in pain, and was horrified by what this man was saying to me. I had never had an abortion. I realized later that he had made assumptions because of how I was dressed, and realized just how crappy people can be sometimes. What is your best "screw it, I'll do this" moment? Story 1. Through a truly stupid series of circumstances, I fell in a very cold creek on the outskirts of my hometown in the presence of my best high school buddy. It was partially his fault. That's my story anyhow. I'm drenched and cold. We get back to my car, and I open my trunk, hoping I've got another coat in there. Nope, all I've got is this ugly butt long-sleeve button-up silk shirt. Why? Because it was freaking 1993, that's why. Now, I've got cloth seats in my little late 80s Nissan, so I'm not getting in the car soaking wet, and nothing has been better than being cold and wet, so I proceed to strip naked, then wrap the silk shirt around me and tie the arms together around my back. It's like an ugly long-sleeve loincloth. I use the windows to sort of pin my clothes to the outside of the car, hoping the wind will dry them out a bit. That's right, all my clothes, undies included, are now on the outside of my car. I get in the car and start to warm up. My friend is almost peeing himself laughing at this scenario. He asks me if I'm actually going to drive like this, to which I say, "You bet your butt I am." As we're getting into town, I look at my fuel gauge and chuckle. "Hey man, guess what?" "What?" "We're almost out of gas." He frowns. "Oh crap, man. Let me get out and pump." "Oh no, dude, I've got this." We cruise right down Main Street, passing not 1, but 2 of our high school cheerleaders on the way. We stop at the gas station at the end of the street, and I proudly stand at the pump in my loincloth, waving at the people who honk and point. My friend has ducked as low as he can in the seat to avoid being seen. We get to my friend's house, and here I'm walking in with my still wet clothes in my supple silk loincloth that I'm starting to kind of like. My friend's mom takes one look at me and says, "I don't want to know," then turns and walks away. Story 2. Every family has their problems, but stuff hit the fan with mine. I didn't have much money, but I ditched everything and booked a ticket to Thailand, where I ended up living for a summer. I recently picked up kickboxing, and as someone who does not drink or do drugs, I just figured I would train twice a day while I enjoyed getting in the best shape of my life. It just started out as training, until one of my trainers suggested I should actually do a professional fight. I just went along with it, and it didn't seem that big of a deal, accepting the offer then and there. They took a quick photo of me and, whatever, continued training. The gym was located on the outskirts of town, so me and some Aussie training buddies suggested that we go into town, get some food, and hit the beaches. That freaking photo they took of me was all over town, on buses, billboards, magazine pamphlets. It was crazy. It was like I was in a dream in some foreign world where everyone instantly respected me, all because I was fighting on this card. Mind you, I have no competitive history. I didn't even do any high school sports, and in my opinion, I don't think I'm that athletic. Anyways, 2 weeks later, after training 2 times every day, fight day comes around at Patong Stadium, and I just about pooped my freaking pants. My opponent is a native Thai with 81 fights and is 28. I am 19 years old, a skinny butt white kid about to go to war, and all I want to do is cry like a little girl. Right before I walked out, the spectators placed bets and touched you up like some gladiator about to get red-rummed. At that moment, as soon as I touched that ring, screw it, I'm fighting as hard as I can, and I'm going the freaking distance, win or lose. I just figured this guy will have to end my life to end it early. I lost. No surprise, my opponent was a veteran compared to me being my first fight. However, I went all 5 rounds and fought hard for 15 minutes. Keep your hands up and keep pushing forward in the ring and in life. Best screw it moment I think I'll have. Story 3. We were at our high school's field day, and that year we happened to go to a beach. About an hour or so in, some guys who were playing football threw the football about 30 feet into the water. Due to the fact that we live in Washington and the water was cold, no one brought swimming material. The dude who brought the ball is freaking out as it was signed by some famous football player. Enter me. I decide, screw it, I'll do this, and swim in after the ball, which at this point was about 40 feet in. Before I go into the freezing water, I decide to take off my shoes and my phone out of my pocket. I neglected to consider my wallet or the fact that I was wearing skinny jeans and a t-shirt. Despite that, I swim out to retrieve the football, succeed, and return to shore. Guy thanks me and goes back to his game. Well, shucks. My clothes are drenched in water, roughly $30 in bills are now soaked, and I have nothing to change into. For 20 minutes, I walked around in wet clothes, asking around to see if I could borrow extra attire from anyone. I got a pair of girls' pink yoga pants. I freaking rock those yoga pants. Moose knuckle and all. Story 4. Girl I was interested in fell asleep beside me in my tiny one-room place, whilst we were watching some 30 Rock after having already watched Die Hard 3 that night. This is only the second or third time she'd come over like this. Episode finishes, I'm trapped under this girl, so I closed up the laptop with my foot and turned off the speakers. She's still asleep. Since we were sitting across the bed, things were a bit awkward. I try to sleep, but it just doesn't work. I pick her up and turn her around the proper way in the bed, then lay down and try to fall asleep beside her, but with a respectable distance between us. Hours go by. I can't sleep. I'm wondering the whole time if she intended to fall asleep here, or was she just exhausted? I debate with myself whether I should try to make a move or not. Somewhere around 3 or 4 a.m., say, screw it, to myself, I lean in and give her a little kiss on the cheek. She responds positively. Cue some very passionate making out over the next who knows how long. Turned out she had fallen asleep on purpose and had been waiting for me to make a move all night. We've now been together 16 months and are planning to get married next year sometime. Great success. Story 5. I'd been staring at this girl in my class for months. Ever since I saw her for the first time, I knew the day would come when I'd be hopelessly in love with her, but wouldn't be able to do anything but watch her being talked to by all the D-bags who obviously thought she was hot and eventually starting to date one of them. Then one day we were left alone in a room for about 15 minutes, and I thought exactly this. Screw it, I'll do this. I hadn't prepared for that moment, and I didn't have a little speech or a plan. I just spilled my little heart out to her, told her everything and all about exactly how I feel. No games, no playing hard to get, no beating around the bush. We are now together and both hopelessly in love with each other. That was the best decision I've ever made, and I still can't get my head around how and why it actually worked. I can't believe that it did, but I couldn't be happier about it. Story 6. My senior year of high school, I fell head over heels in puppy love with possibly the most crushed boy in school. He was on the football team. He was one of the homecoming princes. He was lead in the school play and musical. He was editor-in-chief of the school paper. Valentine's Day was the last day the musical would run. I think it was The Ugly Duckling, but I'm not sure, and I was backstage doing lights with one of my best friends, who knew about my crush. He was doing sound. Near the end of the musical, when the cast was gathering to take a final bow, he moved this rope that kept the crew from walking where we'd be visible, looked at me, and pointed his head toward the stage. I got in a lot of trouble with the theater director and never worked on a play again in high school, but with my legs shaking so hard I was surprised I didn't fall, I walked up to him and kissed him on the cheek. We only went out for 3 days and 2 dates before he had to leave for the Navy, but whenever I'm scared, I tell myself, it can't be worse than kissing your crush in front of your classmates. I'm going to guess that this story took place some time ago, considering that nowadays it doesn't really seem appropriate to take this chance and try to kiss someone who has shown no interest in you yet or whatsoever. Or maybe it did occur recently, and that just makes it even more of a blunder. But that's what makes situations like this so risky. There's a lot to gain if it works in your favor, but if it falls flat, then you got some splaining to do. On a separate note, though, who does this dude think he is, being the head honcho of every extracurricular at the school? Save some accolades for the rest of us, homie. I bet he was also valedictorian and volunteered at an animal shelter, the way this OP describes him. Anyway, I did look up the play that she referenced, and it's actually called The Ugly Barnacle. It's about an ugly barnacle that was so ugly, everybody died. Managers, what is the silliest reason you have had an employee call in sick? Story 1. Oh, I just had a good sick versus vacation day lie a few weeks ago. Not necessarily an excuse, but just a straight-up lie. I run the rental department for a group of heavy-duty truck dealerships, box trucks, 18-wheelers, dump trucks, school buses, etc., which means I end up going to the DMV a lot to get tags for new rental trucks and stuff. I also have my 2 of my own separate shops from the rest of the dealership to work on my own trucks, and my own trucks only. One Monday, I had a young, new mechanic call into my shop manager saying he'd caught a stomach bug over the weekend, wasn't feeling much better yet, hadn't slept, etc. Shop manager tells me he's out, my guys do the best they can while down a mechanic. After lunch that day, I go to the DMV to title and register 2 new trucks. Side note, in bigger towns, DMV will occasionally have separate windows for dealers and another for large fleets. Who do I see in the line for the general public registering his new crotch rocket? Guy who called in sick. I just called out his name quietly and waved and told him I was glad he felt better. He used to call out sick every once in a while on a Monday. We usually assumed he was sleeping off a bender. Anyway, he hasn't called in sick on a Monday since then. Story 2. Obligatory not a manager, but going to tell on myself for a silly out sick reason. I once had to call out sick because my mother brought home a puppy, set it on my lap, where he fell asleep, and then left to go out shopping, and I didn't know when she'd be back. I wasn't really a dog person, and I was the only one home, and this was a brand new animal in the house that I had to keep out of things, so I called in because I had a puppy asleep on my lap. My boss was less than thrilled that that was my reason, but the way I saw it, I had little other choice. The dog didn't have a crate or anywhere I'd feel safe leaving him for 5 minutes, let alone 5 hours. Still kept my job and got to explain the situation better when I went in the next day. Boss was initially angry on the phone, but with more context and a chat with his wife, and he understood a bit better. Bonus icing on the poopy cake to that day, the puppy woke up at some point and started making a low grumbly noise. I didn't know what he was doing, so I brought him over to my bed to pet him and check him over, make sure he was okay. He needed to pee, so he peed on my bed. For frick's sake. Story 3. 2 from me as the employee and not the manager. I got bit by my cat and had to go to the ER. I spent all night there. I had to get all sorts of IV antibiotics. I called my boss the next morning saying I couldn't come in for a cat bite. He said, "You're not coming in because a cat bite? Whatever." Click. I come in the next day all bandaged up, and he's apologizing. His wife is a nurse, and when he got home and told the story, she yelled at him and explained how serious it could be. The day prior, I went tubing down a river and didn't put sunscreen on my legs, and I got a bad sunburn. I can hardly stand or walk, it hurts so much. There's only me and another girl who do the job we do. She works AM and I PM. If one calls in sick, they have to work a double. So I call in sick for a sunburn. She's like, whatever, it's kinda BS, but I'll cover for you. I come in the next day in shorts and sandals because I could not have pants touching my legs. Totally against dress code. She sees how bad the sunburn is and says, "Holy cow, I didn't realize how bad it was. Do you want to go home?" Cat scratch fever is a real thing. For one, a hearty scratch from your cat's insanely sharp claws hurts like a mother. But then I guess there's cat saliva bacteria on top of that or something that causes an infection. Not to mention if they've got microscopic flecks of kitty litter on their nails. I guess litter alone apparently can cause people to go crazy from something called toxoplasmosis parasites that's found in their doo-doo. One of the reasons that pregnant people can't change the litter. And a not so far-fetched theory for why crazy cat ladies exist, like Eleanor Abernathy from The Simpsons. Story 4. I'm not a manager, but I'm a floor installer, and I run my own crew from time to time. We had this one guy who's constantly complaining about how broke he is and how he needs to work so badly, and yet he just didn't ever want to actually show up. Here's a selection of my favorite of his excuses. There was a construction truck parked blocking his driveway. I thought, why not ask them to move? Someone had allegedly been messing with him and slowly letting the air out of his tires. Clearly, they couldn't possibly be leaking. They were only 5 years old. Someone had broken into his vehicle under cover of night, removed the motor that operates the windows, and replaced it with a burnt-out one on the driver's side, so now his window barely works. I mean, the car's only about 13 years old. Couldn't be wearing out by itself. We offered this dude a full-time job with a guaranteed permanent position if he proves himself. He proved that he would rather come up with any reason to not work. Story 5. Not in a managing position, but man, do I love the stuff I hear in the office. During lunch break, there was this overweight lady discussing something with a coworker. I didn't pick up the conversation, but all I heard was, "Your hate and negativity against me are so painful, I might throw up." Half an hour later, I hear from her boss that she threw up in the restroom and had to go home since she doesn't feel safe right now. Dude then asked me if I know anything, and I said no, as I didn't want to get involved. He further asks how often I've been sick in the last 3 years. Tell him I have no recorded sick days in the last 3 years, and he just goes, "Wow, that must be hard." I'm like, the frick? Story 6. I called out one day to my crappy job at a call center because my sandal broke while I was walking there. I can't walk the rest of the way barefoot. I didn't give a crap about that job, and the day I finally quit, I just walked out in the middle of my shift. Also, at a different job, I gave my friend a good reference and she ended up getting hired. Well, that was a huge mistake because she was a terrible employee and called out all the time. One day she called in saying she couldn't come in because she had gone to the cabin for the weekend and decided to stay longer. She got fired after like 2 months. Story 7. Black Friday in a big box retailer. Employee calls in about 25 minutes before we open on cell phone because they can't get through on the store phones. Imagine that. Says, "I'm not going to make it tonight. I have to take my mom's dog to the vet." For those of you that haven't worked retail in a big box, every employee works Thanksgiving and Black Friday weekend in our location. We even have district and market managers that come into stores and sell. Our company even does dry runs prior to Black Friday earlier in the month, where everyone comes in and the shift that isn't working role plays as customers to ensure we don't screw up line management. Said employee no longer works there. Story 8. I was managing the biggest Wendy's in my mall, which was over 9 staff, and one day I felt so sick, woke up with actually a poo in my bed, and thought, oh God, no way, that's so gross. When I got into work, I drank a whole bottle of Pepto-Bismol, and it made my stomach way worse actually, so I started to burp a lot, and asked Ricky if he can be the manager for today. I'm simply too ill to deal with the day-to-day operations of the largest Wendy's in my mall. Well, the next day I get a call and Ricky says, "Gig's up, Witch. I'm the manager now, boy, so don't come in." Story 9. I'm not a manager, but I did once have a weird reason for calling off. My car died right as I was pulling into my garage. My neighbor had to help me push it in the rest of the way. My girlfriend lent me her car to take to work. I drove down to the corner station to top off the tank. Her car died at the gas station. This was at about 9 p.m. on a Saturday. No rental place was open, no one I could call for a ride or borrow another car. Had to call off because I had no way of getting there. People thought I was calling off to get a 3-day weekend. Story 10. It was me. I phoned work to tell them I wouldn't be in because I had locked myself in my house. I had just moved house that weekend, didn't yet have a key for the back door. Locked the front door Sunday evening from the inside and went to bed. Woke up Monday morning, turned the key in the lock, and it just sheared off, leaving the door locked from the inside with remains of the key in the hole. Had to ring up the letting agent and get them to come let me out with their spare key. Was 4 hours late to work. There was much crap talking when I got to work. Story 11. Not a manager, but a team lead. Problem I have is getting too much info from those calling in sick. Really just emails or IMs, no one calls anymore. At my company, you're not required to disclose the reason for taking the time, as long as you have it. Can't tell you how many times people start describing their messed up medical problems, and I'm just thinking, please stop, I don't need to know. The vast majority are from our folks in our remote center in India. Some examples: I have an open sore on my face, some sort of fungus. My throat is swollen and I'm coughing up pus. I'm having uncontrollable bowel movements. People who hired a personal investigator, what did you uncover? Story 1. Okay, so I'll bite. Nothing like hunting down a psycho ex or anything like that, but interesting enough. So I was living in England and had an uncle living in assisted living in California. He was 95 at the time. A little fuzzy about some things, but on the whole, sharp as a tack. He was deeply religious and attended church weekly. A couple of women from the church had made friends with him, drove him to the church, brought him trinkets and whatnot, basically took care of him, sort of. Sounded okay to me. Hell, I was in England. What was I going to do? The only thing that jarred me a little bit was one time when I talked to the woman on the phone, one of them told me that my uncle had signed over power of attorney to them. That struck me as a little odd. My uncle and I weren't really close, but being his heir, along with my brother, wouldn't he have told me about it? I shrugged it off, though. Again, what was I going to do? I was 6,000 miles away. Besides, and this is what gets a lot of people, he was of sound mind. He was a free agent, so it was really none of my freaking business. A year or two go by. I check on him periodically. Everything seems fine. I come home one night and my phone is ringing. It's the assisted care residence. Oh crap, what's happened? Is he dead? He's 97 freaking years old. I was expecting it any day. No, it's these two little old ladies. They're trying to get my uncle to sign over power of attorney to them. Wait a minute, hadn't he already done that? The alarm bells go off. Something is deeply wrong, and it was going to take me at least 24 hours to get back to California, given connections, flights, renting a car, blah, blah, blah. So I called a private investigator from England, tell him the situation, and as soon as I can get to the part about the woman, he stops me and says, "Wait, let me tell you how this story goes." He then proceeds to tell me that this is a common scam. These women cruise the churches looking for these little old guys who, on the surface, have no family to speak of and healthy retirement and investment accounts. So I get my butt back to California ASAP. And fortunately, my uncle has signed nothing, although at this point, they're harassing him hard. They had even kidnapped him and taken him to an attorney and tried to get him to sign over POA to them. Little did they know who they were dealing with. My dad's side of the family gets the gold standard for stubbornness. I learned this early on when my dad said, no, that was it, give it up, because that was an answer that was not going to change. My uncle, all 100 pounds and 97 years of him, had dug in his heels. So we sign over power of attorney to me, and now the hunt begins. Where was his accounts? These women handed over nothing to me, a few receipts, but no accounts, nothing. So this PI ended up hanging out for a few days, tracking everything down. I cannot begin to tell you how much I learned from this man, a complete original. Vietnam vet, former SEAL, carried a knife in his boot and a gun in his shoulder holster. So he shows me, it's mostly research, and that I resonate to, since I'm in research. Painstaking, boring, turning over one pebble at a time kind of investigation. Knowing how to talk to people, how to observe. It requires a massive amount of patience. We went to every bank within 20 miles, and by schmoozing and showing my power of attorney, we found what we thought was every account. I then went over everything. They had played a shell game, borrowed from him, hadn't quite stolen from him, but it took quite a while to figure out what they had done. Then I find the piece de résistance. That's my best attempt at French there. They had him sign over all of his retirement accounts to them, or more specifically, to the younger one, being a spry 81 years old. So we do some further investigation. Turns out this one is broke. Looks like she sent it back to the Philippines or something. She spent a lot of time in Vegas. So here's how it shakes out, a common scam. These two little Jezebels made a play for my uncle, who fell for the younger one, hook, line, and sinker. They get him to sign over all of his retirement accounts to them, and then all they have to do is outlive him, at 81 and 83 respectively, and my uncle, 97, should be easy. So I confront them, told them that I knew what they were doing, and that I could turn them in. I had the evidence. I didn't really, I only strongly suspected, if they didn't tell me what else they had done. So they spilled the beans, told me what they had done. They swore they had only borrowed the money. We got it all signed back over. I didn't turn them in. I figured it would all come out in the wash anyway. I didn't want to see them go to jail, and I wasn't sure I could prove it anyway. But if it wasn't for this private investigator who had my back, they would have gotten away with it. I'm a firm believer I learned a poop ton from him. Now, for the editorial, this crime is rampant, intimidating, bamboozling, and ripping off the elderly. Most DAs won't touch it. If you ever get a whiff that an elderly relative is being abused or ripped off, if it even crosses your mind, step in immediately. Kick butt and take names. You may be the only defense they have. But I'll tell you, it turned out to be one of the most interesting experiences of my life. My uncle got the last laugh. He outlived both of them and passed away peaceably at 100 years old with me there with him. One of the last things he told me was that he had forgiven them for what they had done. Too long didn't read. Elderly uncle is nearly scammed out of $500,000 by a couple of Jezebels cruising the churches. PI steps in and saves the day. I learn a crap ton. Story 2. We discovered that the driver who hit me not only went off the side of the road where I was, legally, four-wheeling on a quad, and she was talking on the cell phone, looking into the passenger seat, driving with no insurance and a revoked license because of previous convictions for causing accidents. After the truck, pushing my quad in a T-bone position, plowed so much dirt up in front of us that after 70 feet it finally came to a halt. The investigator had evidence that she was driving 35 miles per hour in a 25 zone, and she didn't brake after impact. After the truck came to a stop, she jumped out and started running away, but witnesses caught her and held her there. My friend, who was sitting behind me, both of us 14, were carted off in ambulances, and I never saw the woman's face. The trooper wrote the report that I, 14 years old, had taken an RV instead of ATV and pulled out in front of the woman, even though it was clear the accident happened off the roadway. The trooper interrogated me while I was laying on the ground, waiting for ambulances, before my parents even arrived. I was in shock while he rephrased the question, "Have you had any alcoholic or illegal substances today?" several times. My neighbors finally asked him to wait until my parents arrived. In the hospital room, he questioned me further while my parents were on their way. The nurse had to ask him to stop, as my neck was being evaluated, and I had not even had pain medication yet. The accident was deemed my fault, although there were 2 eyewitnesses who testified against the woman to the trooper and later in court, and I was told by the DMV I would have to pay the woman's truck damages before I was allowed to get a driver's license, and I carried SR22 insurance for 5 years after I received it. The investigator uncovered proof that the trooper knew the woman who hit me and was possibly family friends with her. For the months in between the accident and when the investigation was complete, I fought an awful amount of guilt, believing it was my fault, and not having any memory of the accident. My friend's leg was badly injured and required extensive surgeries over the next 5 years, and she was visiting from Texas and had to be med-evac'd back there via helicopter, which left her family with a huge financial burden. During that time, I even considered ending my life, and took one attempt that thankfully failed. My parents took the case to the state Supreme Court over the course of the next 3 years, and when we finally came to trial, the judge said the only way the report could be cleared and the financial obligations relieved is if the state trooper took back his statement. When we began going that route, we were told the trooper had been dismissed from the force for wrongful behavior, and his testimony was worth nothing. That was an expensive lesson in corruption. The financial stress contributed greatly to my parents' divorce. However, if we hadn't hired the investigator, we may have gone on thinking it was my fault. I'm very thankful to know that it truly wasn't. Story 3. My wife hired one. She found that she was wasting money, and that I'm a very boring person. We came from different cultures, but we knew we wanted to be with each other. She's Hispanic, born in another country, and I'm a hillbilly from Appalachia. There was a lot of jealousy early on both sides, because we simply couldn't relate. After a while, I grew tired of being suspicious, and told her that if she wanted to be with someone else, to just tell me, and I'll move on. But just tell me. It was very freeing for me. I guess to her, though, it only made her more suspicious. I got off work at 7 a.m. and there wasn't much to do, and not many places that were open for a couple more hours, so I would go to the gym. She worked an early first shift job, so we didn't see each other in the mornings, and I guess she didn't like not being able to account for the gap between me leaving work and me coming back to the apartment. The guy she hired to follow me around was terrible. I had my routine: get off work, go to the gym, go grab some breakfast, hit up Blockbuster, maybe go to a pet store. We had birds and fish. At the time in the morning, these places are empty. Like I said, I'm a boring person. Cut to a few days later, I leave the gym and the new guy behind. Head to a restaurant and in comes the new guy from the gym. Creepy. I eat, then leave, go to Blockbuster, and in he comes. So here I am, suspicious. The next day at the gym, I'm telling my buddy about how creepy it was for the new guy to show up everywhere I go, and he agrees. I'm done working out and tell my buddy that I'm going to leave, and that I'm going to a specific pet store. And if the guy leaves the gym right after me, that my buddy should head to the same pet store. And that was what happened. I go to the store, a couple minutes later, in walks the guy, and a minute after that, in comes my buddy. We ended up pinning the guy to the floor. I asked why, and he starts saying that it's just a job, and that he ain't seen nothing. We released him back into the wilds, with the order that he's not to show up at the gym again. I get home, call her up, and say that she hired the biggest idiot around, and that she needs to stop wasting money. She asks what happened. I tell her to ask him, since she gave him some money. Her jealousy died down after that. Well, that and I made the ultimate quote to her that made sense. I said, "If I was getting laid as much as you think I am, wouldn't I be a lot happier?" And that was that. For those folks hoping for a different ending, sorry to disappoint. We've been together for almost a quarter of a century, and everything is fine. Maybe she just couldn't believe that she was involved with someone so boring. Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.